Alright everyone, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a really long time since I last filmed. The last video I put up was the one of me getting my hair cut off. Honestly, life's still continued to be trying me since then, so it's been hard times and I really haven't been in the best mood to sit down and film. I have filmed a couple of bits here and there and then they didn't really come to anything. Or I wasn't happy with the footage, or it just wasn't worth posting really. Anyway, one of the reasons for this is because of recent events in my life, just a couple of different things that have happened. My anxiety disorder's been basically playing up a lot more frequently than it used to. This has probably been going on for about 4-5 months now. 4 months almost exactly, I think, maybe 3.5 months. That it's been, you know, at its kind of worst, if that makes sense. I've had it worse in the past, but it's definitely in a bad way right now. Anyway, last night I was led in bed and I suddenly had this moment where I just thought, why don't I just brave it up and just film a video talking about my anxiety disorder, because I know a lot of other people out there have anxiety disorders too. It's becoming more and more common, and even people who don't have anxiety disorders will have at some point experienced actual anxiety in their lives. Panic attacks and anxiety attacks are becoming really very common. I don't meet many people now that haven't had an experience with it at some point. So I thought basically I'd sit down and just explain or just tell you the story of where my anxiety has come from and kind of my little journey up to this point. So I thought I'd start this off by just telling you about where I first experienced this and where it came from, and we'll sort of go from there. If anyone wanted to know more, or if anyone had any questions, then we could maybe do more of this. I'm not even sure if I want to post this because I'm so uncomfortable talking about my anxiety. I have mentioned it in previous vlogs and videos, so I know that you guys know I have an anxiety disorder, and a few people have asked me questions here and there, but I've never really addressed it to a particular point. So anyway, I'm just going to jump straight into the story. So I developed I think it was diagnosed as a social anxiety disorder about 6 years ago, roughly 5 or 6 years ago now. So when I was growing up, I was a very, very shy child, and I used to experience anxiety sort of off and on throughout my teen years, really. I didn't know it was anxiety. I just thought I was really, really shy. So I think I've always been an anxious, nervous person throughout my whole life. I just didn't perhaps have a disorder. So I've always been a nervous, shy person until I got to maybe 18, 19, where I suddenly kind of came into my own and I became way more confident and life became so much happier for me, and I started just getting out there and talking to people and making friends, and I was really confident. And so I'm very lucky that I crossed over that shy border and became a very confident person around a good age to do it, I think 18, 19. Anyway, as you guys know, when I was 24, I was diagnosed with cancer of the head and neck. I don't know if I ever mentioned that, I think I did. So that involved quite a lot of different treatments, surgeries, etc. Now, after the surgeries, the final kind of part of my treatment was that I had to go to a hospital in London. Now, I'm from a tiny little village in the middle of Wiltshire, so I never grew up in big cities. I was from the country. I lived in Salisbury for a long time, which was a small city, but London was a big city as far as I was concerned. And at the time, I hadn't ever experienced that kind of lifestyle. So I got sent to London for radiation therapy and 2 sessions of chemotherapy as well during that. So I was there for a very long time. I don't remember exactly how long, but it felt like a year to me, but I think it was more like 6 months, maybe. I'm afraid my memories of that point in time are a little hazy in places. I find it very hard to like pinpoint specific things, but for the point of this, that'll be fine. So when I was in London having my treatment, for the most part, it went really well. The people in the hospitals treated me lovely. Everyone was really nice. It was, it wasn't a good time in my life. It was bloody hard, but I got through it okay. And I remember people kept saying to me like, oh God, you're so positive all the time. God, you're handling this so well. We can't believe how like happy and positive you are despite the fact you're going through this. And I remember being like, yeah, well, you've got to stay positive because, it's happening. There's nothing you can do to change the fact it's happening. Obviously, part of that was a front. I didn't want my family and friends to be sad, so I used to act happier than I maybe was. I remember I used to post things on Facebook constantly, like really quite chirpy sounding statuses and things, when maybe I was actually, I wasn't miserable, but I definitely wasn't happy. But I did try to be as positive as possible for the sake of people around me and for my friends. Now, that brings me to my first ever anxiety attack. So at one point, my weight had dropped to what was becoming quite a dangerous level. And I remember that my nutritionist and my person in charge of my treatment, I don't remember any of the names now, basically said to me that I had to try not to lose any more weight, or they were going to have to fit me with a feeding tube. So I tried, but eating was not something I was very able to do, and unfortunately it got to a point where they said, right, we're going to have to fit you with a feeding tube because you're getting dangerously underweight now. So I agreed. I was like, yeah, that's fine. They told me that the operation to fit the feeding tube, it's not even an operation, the procedure to fit the feeding tube would not be, I wouldn't be put out, so I wouldn't be asleep, I would be awake while they were doing it. And at this point I'd never had an operation without being completely under anaesthetic. So on this occasion, my sister had taken the day off work, and she came to my hospital room, and she came with me, and we went to another hospital which was down the road to have this procedure. I don't even remember how we got there, I really don't. But we sat there in the waiting room, and I remember I was just really nervous, but no more nervous than I would be for any other normal thing. So at this point it was just a normal day for me, just feeling very, very nervous, but God, I can't wait for this to be over. Now they took me into the operating room, and this is where my memories get very hazy, but I can tell you exactly what I do remember. So I went into the room, and there was, I think, 4 or 5 people, women and men, all dressed in, their white gear, and they were all very friendly. And I got up on the table in my gown thing, where you're not wearing any clothes underneath, and I led down on the table, and they strapped my arms down, and they were kind of talking about the procedure to me. And as they were talking, I remember becoming dizzy and almost feeling hot. And even right now, while talking about it, I'm getting these feelings. This is how bad my anxiety is when I think about these things, which is why I don't tend to talk about it very often. So I might need to take a break, but I'll keep going if I can. But it was almost like my entire body became like it was on fire, like I was so hot, and I suddenly realized that I couldn't catch my breath, so I was kind of hyperventilating. And at this point, I remember looking down at my stomach, which they were shaving like a little gap on my stomach next to my belly button, and they had the scalpels and things on the table, and they were like, right, we're ready, so we're going to go ahead and do this now. And they literally were coming towards my stomach, and I don't know if they were holding a scalpel or what they were holding. I can't remember, but I just remember at that point I went into what I now know is called flight or fight mode, which is part of anxiety. So basically at that point, rather than flight, I went into fight mode. So I just remember, I can't explain it other than saying I freaked out. And I was doing everything in my power to not let them touch me. And it was so bizarre. It was an out of body experience because it didn't feel like me. And I remember I managed to get my arm loose, and I swung out and I knocked one of the nurses or doctors, I don't know what she was, but I kind of knocked her out of the way. And then eventually they kind of all stopped, and I was led there crying hysterically. And I couldn't stop crying, like seriously wailing, screaming for help, crying. And eventually they sat me up and they said, don't move, stay here, we're gonna get you a wheelchair. and they put me in a wheelchair because I couldn't walk, I couldn't get off the table. And I just remember being sat in this tiny room, and this woman has said to me, like, just put your legs between your, put your head between your legs and just try and catch your breath. And I was sat there, and I didn't know what was happening. And it was honestly, like, even remembering it now, it's so bizarre because I can't think how it felt exactly. But my sister came in about 10 minutes later, and my sister's a nurse, and she was, what's happened? And I was just like, I don't know. And I started crying again. And then my sister took me in my wheelchair down to, I don't know if we got in an ambulance or a taxi, I can't remember, but we went back to the original hospital, and I don't remember any of that. And then I remember being led in the bed in my little room, so I had this little tiny room to myself during this point, and I remember being in there with my sister, and I just remember I cried and cried and cried and cried, and I talked about so much. I'm not a secretive person, but there are certain things that I keep private, like everybody does, and for some reason I was blurting all of that private stuff out, and I cried so much, and my sister cried because I think she got so upset seeing me like that. And then, yeah, so that was the first time I ever had an anxiety attack. Now, unfortunately, after that, life kind of returned to normal. So I was still having my treatments and stuff, but I started to have anxiety more and more in different places. And one day, probably a month after I'd finished treatment completely, so at this point, I'm back at home with my parents, and they're working, and I'm kind of there in the day, just kind of focusing on getting better, recovering. I knew I was feeling off. I knew there was something weird about me, but I couldn't tell what it was. I didn't know it was anxiety. And then there was this one day when the neighbours, there's two older chaps who live next to my parents, and they're both lovely. And they were in their garden, and I went to take the bins out, and I realised they were in the garden, and I found myself hiding behind the door. So I opened the door to leave the house and then hid behind it, and I was frozen, and I just stayed there until I couldn't hear their voices anymore. And then I closed the door again because I was so frightened they would see me, and I was frightened they would see me hiding behind the door. And then there was another occasion when I was going to go for a walk to our little local shop in the village, which is just literally just 5 minutes down the road. And I got dressed, I did everything, I even put the dog on the lead, went to walk to the door, and I was just absolutely frozen. I couldn't open the door. I just felt really frightened, and that's the only way to explain it, is frightened, like scared, and I can't explain what I'm scared of when that happens. I just feel in danger. So at that point, I knew this was not normal, and I said to my mum that afternoon about it, and I basically said, this has been happening, and I'm becoming really worried because I think I'm developing agoraphobia, which is the disorder where you cannot leave your house. And I was like, please tell me I'm not developing that somehow. My doctors put me in touch with a clinical psychologist. Her name was Emma, and I went to see her in Salisbury General, actually, in their, I guess, psychiatric ward, I think. So I went to see her, and I remember on my first session, I went and I just spent the entire session crying because I had got so worked up and so anxious trying to get to the appointment that I walked into the appointment and I just burst into tears, and I was a complete mess. And that was just from like people seeing me in the car park and feeling like I was on show and stuff. So I went to, I think, 12 to 14 sessions with her. And by the time I finished that, she had taught me all these kind of coping mechanisms and things. The main one was the rose-colored glasses technique, which I still use to this day. So that's when you're walking down the street and if people are staring at you, because that was my thing. I used to become so conscious of people looking at me, and I used to immediately think they were looking at me because there was something wrong with me, whether it just be that I was ugly or whether they could tell I had cancer, whether they could tell I'd had surgery. I can't explain it. I just became very conscious every time anyone looked at me, and I'm still a little like that to this day. But I do use the rose-colored glasses technique, which is whenever someone looks at you, you have to just tell yourself that they're looking at you for a good reason. So like someone's staring at me, so walking down the street, even today, this morning, a chap was walking towards me on the street and he was staring at me. I look back, my immediate thing in my brain is he's thinking like, that guy's fat or something. And then I just remind myself, no, there's every chance that he's looking at you thinking like, I like that guy's t-shirt. Where did he get the necklace from? He's got a cool beard. Do you know what I mean? It could be any multitude of things a person's thinking about you when they look at you. And the chances are it's a positive thing. It's never necessarily a negative thing. And so I just do that now, and that kind of gets me by. And now, years later, my anxiety in general doesn't affect me anywhere near as bad as it used to. But recently there has been a few just crap things have happened. I lost my full-time job, as you know, and my basically my kind of social life's changed a lot. Just not anything I've done myself, just the way life is. Sometimes things change. So I have found myself just feeling a bit like lost and not really fitting. So that's kind of, I think that's the root cause of my anxiety being worse right now. But it's getting there, it really is, and I'm practicing techniques all the time. I'm working on it. I'm feeling a little better all the time. I just really wanted to sit down and kind of talk about this today. I just felt like a lot of people are confused about anxiety and wonder, you know, what is it, where does it come from and stuff. I can't say that everybody has a root cause like I do, but mine definitely had a root cause. Before I had my panic attack in that hospital, I've never really had a big issue with anxiety. So yeah, that's kind of the story of where my anxiety disorder came from. If you have any questions or you'd like me to tell any more stories about this or anything, let me know below, because this is a video I'm kind of nervous to post, and it would be nice to know if this video has been helpful or just interesting to anybody, and if it's the sort of thing people would want to know more about. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope I'll have more interesting videos for you coming up. There should be a couple. I've got a couple in the works already, but it just kind of depends how things pan out at the moment. But I'm going to be posting, don't worry, and I will be posting as soon as possible. I'm trying to get myself back into that kind of normal habit of just filming like I used to. So yeah, thanks very much for watching. If you're not already and you'd like to be, remember to subscribe, so click the subscribe button below the video. If you don't have a YouTube account, just create one. It takes like 5 seconds, and then subscribe. And whack the like button as well, just to let me know that you did enjoy this. All right, thanks very much, and I will talk to you again soon.